Today we're going to discuss how being a vegan or being a carnivore can help you lose weight, reverse insulin resistance, manage type 2 diabetes, avoid heart disease, and probably avoid every other chronic disease known to man. Virtually every chronic disease known to man can be caused and contributed to by what we're going to talk about today, and that's what we put into our bodies, right? And the only reason we have to have this conversation is because we're all so lucky and blessed to live in a country where we have choices to choose anything we want to eat every day of the week. Anything that's ever been called food in the history of the planet is available to us in arm's reach, totally affordable in a supermarket, and it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That level of abundance has never been seen before on the planet, and we're fortunate enough to live in a country where we have those freedoms. Now, this is why we have to become experts in what we need to express health. Now, I'm not a fan of dictating to people what they should and shouldn't do. I want people to make their own choices, but I want them to make informed choices, educated choices. And in today's world, if you're not educated about nutrition and how it affects you, well, then you're just going to find yourself fumbling forward throughout your life and then managing disease as it pops up. And that's pretty much what got us into this mess in this country to begin with. And I firmly believe in longevity. And by longevity, we mean not only living long, but living well for a long time. Okay, with all that being said, before I get started on how being a carnivore or being a vegan can both lead to the same place, which a lot of people would disagree with, and they wouldn't be wrong, but they also wouldn't be right unless they listened to this video and maybe found something in what I was saying that was wrong, and that's certainly possible. We're going to discuss the topic of energy toxicity, but before we do so, my name is Dr. Stephen Giannopoulos. I'm known on social media as Dr. Stephen G. Subscribe to my page, hit that little bell, get notified every time I post a new video. Okay, so what we want to talk about here is energy toxicity, meaning energy toxicity refers to how much energy we put into our body and where that energy is coming from. Energy is food. Simple as that. The sun hits the earth grows plants. Animals eat those plants. We eat those plants, or we eat the animals that ate the plants, and that's the cycle, so to speak. And energy toxicity occurs when it can occur in several ways. One is when we adulterate that food source to exist in a manner in which our bodies are not used to adapting to, or if our energy consumption far exceeds our energy expenditure. Both situations are what I believe to be very common in the standard American diet or the standard westernized diet, and I'll explain why. Now, first of all, too much energy coming in. All right, so we're adapted to be very energy efficient because over hundreds of thousands and millions of years, our genetics got used to the fact that there was sometimes feast and there was sometimes famine. And when there's famine, we don't need to be struggling. We need to be able to adapt. And we certainly can. We're built for that. But we never have famine. Matter of fact, we have overabundance. And therefore, that overabundance, our body's trying to deal with it. So just imagine you're in your kitchen and the garbage can's full, but nobody takes the garbage out. So you just keep piling the garbage on top of the full garbage can. It starts to spill over onto the floor, the counters. There's just garbage everywhere. Well, that's kind of embarrassing. So you have a choice. You can take the garbage out and then, have a clean kitchen, or leave the garbage can there full. Take all the garbage that you have on the floor and the counters, tuck them neatly away into the cupboards. Your kitchen can look clean, but it's still filling up with garbage. It still stinks. Well, that's kind of what's happening to us. We're taking the food that we're consuming, using some of it. We're using less of it than we ever did before because we can sit at a computer 40 hours a week and not expend a whole lot of energy. But also, even though we're more sedentary, we're also consuming more food because much of the food we have access to is highly processed. And that highly processed quality of the food makes it so that our appetite is not satiated. So we take in more than we burn. We have to store it. We start filling up the cupboards. We start filling up our fat cells, right? Our fat cells grow and grow and grow. We don't make more fat cells. Some people do, but for this, all intents and purposes, for most of us, our fat cells just get bigger. And when they do, they get more toxic. Why? Because think about it. A cell that's getting bigger is moving further and further away from its energy supply, from its blood supply, from its oxygen supply. And the body has to do backflips in order to create more blood vessels to bring more oxygen and energy to those fat cells. Fat cells are alive. They don't just sit there. So in order to do that, those fat cells have to release inflammatory markers or cytokines, we we call them. That inflammation stimulates the production of new blood vessels, and now we're getting bigger, we're getting fatter, we're getting more inflamed, and this all contributes to a cascade of events that we can go into detail about, but we're not going to. Insulin resistance and high blood pressure and all the things. All right. With that being said, the solution to the increased fat cell size is to stop putting fat inside of the cell. Now, when I say fat cell, you think, well, how do you get fat inside the cell? You must have to eat fat. Well, that's not true. You have to make fat. And when you make fat, you have to deposit it somewhere. What can you make fat from? You can make fat from fat, and you can make fat from sugar. And we do. We make fat from fat, and we make fat from sugar. The way we prevent the fat cell from growing is by decreasing the energy intake, so lowering your calories, and affecting the hormonal response that we have to the food we eat. We can't ignore the hormones. There's a lot of hormones in the body. Cortisol, adrenaline, sex hormones, all of them create different situations for what we do with our energy. But the one at the very top of that list is called insulin. Insulin is the hormone that we use to kind of take the food that we brought into our system, take that energy and kind of push it into the cells to be stored for later when we might need it. Now, one thing we know is that if insulin is present in the bloodstream, if insulin is high, there's no reason for a fat cell to ever let fat out. So if you have a fat cell and there's insulin in the system, there's no reason for that fat cell to release fat. Insulin resistance means, by definition, you need more insulin to deal with the food that you're eating. So hyperinsulinemia, meaning too much insulin in your blood, is a part of this story, and it will not allow the energy to be released from the cell back into the bloodstream for us to use. Now, we know this is true. We know this is true because we just take a look at a type 1 diabetic who can't make insulin. If they don't take insulin, they can eat thousands of calories and their fat will just melt away. Now, that's a deadly situation, but that's actually what happens. In the absence of insulin, your fat cells get smaller. So this is why the treatment for type 2 diabetes for hundreds of years, really before we had drugs to treat it, was low carbohydrate diet, right? Carbohydrates is the stimulus to release insulin. Now, again, I did say going carnivore, which is low carbohydrate, and going vegan, which is high carbohydrate, can both accomplish the same thing. Not the same thing, but a similar thing. We have to recognize that energy toxicity doesn't only come from the amount of food we eat, but the composition of that food. Food that we are adapted to genetically as humans, as the human animal, are the foods that exist on the planet in their natural state. So just imagine food that looks the way it did when it grew out of the ground, was walking on the earth, swimming in the ocean, unadulterated. Those foods have certain characteristics. If I'm going to eat an animal, if I'm going to be a carnivore, that fat and protein come together, okay? So the energy source is the fat. Protein is what we use to build our structure. We can use protein for energy, but we tend to not do so unless we're starving. We don't want to, it's kind of a waste to use protein for energy. Protein is very expensive. Okay, but there's plenty of fat, and fat can easily be used for energy. Or we can eat plants. Now, if given the choice to eat plants or animals, most humans in an indigenous environment, meaning usually you don't have those kinds of choices in nature, right? If we were Native Americans living a couple of hundred years ago in North America, we're either going to eat the buffalo or we're going to eat what's growing out of the ground. And I believe everywhere on this planet, if the choice is the buffalo or some skinny little carrot or a crab apple, because the apples in those days were not these big juicy apples that we've hybridized and created through farming techniques, I believe every human is going to go for the buffalo. Okay. Now, with that being said, rarely did you make, if you killed the buffalo, you weren't looking for a salad to have at the same time. You kill the buffalo, you eat the buffalo. And then if you can't find a buffalo for a week, well, then you can start eating some tubers and things that are growing in the ground just as a way to kind of get you to your next kill, your next deer, your next squirrel, your next buffalo. That, I believe, is the natural human state. I could be wrong. But with that being said, if you're going to eat plant food, well, then that plant food comes with fiber and carbohydrate. There are some foods that come with fat, but that fat is attached to fiber. So just think of an avocado. So most plant food is going to be carbohydrate and fiber, and most animal food is going to be protein and fat. Those are the combinations. If you choose to eat fruits and vegetables in their natural state, there will be so much fiber attached to that carbohydrate that chances are going from the standard American diet to a vegan diet is going to net give you a whole lot less insulin. And the fiber, which is indigestible to mammals and humans, even if you eat an abundance of volume of food, that fiber will prevent your insulin resistance. And assuming that you're physically active and doing what it takes to be out in the sun and hunt or gather, not hunt. So we're adapted, we're omnivores. We're adapted to be healthy in both situations. What we're not adapted to is taking that food that grows out of the ground, taking those grains, legumes, fruits, processing them, removing the fiber, and combining them with highly tasty fats. When you take the sugar from grains and combine it with fats, regardless of what the source of the fat is, just think you take wheat, turn it into flour, which is carbohydrate, you make a dough out of it, you fry the dough in fat, and you have a donut. So now you have fat and carbohydrate with no fiber, virtually no fiber, and that combination has never been seen by us genetically, and therefore, when we eat that kind of food, we're asking for a whole lot of trouble. And that comes in the form of insulin resistance, increasing fat stores or adiposity, just all of the problems associated with those diseases we mentioned in the beginning of the video. So processed food, again, you could say cooking is processing. You wouldn't be wrong, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is processed food where, think about corn chips that are, corn flour turned into a chip, fried, and it's amazing, right? I mean, ice cream, think about what ice cream is. It's sugar and dairy. Speaking of dairy, the only place you'll find sugar combined with protein and fat is going to be dairy, right? Because babies, which is all mammals, spend their initial feeding on mother's milk, dairy. That's the only place where we have this abundance of fat, protein, and carbohydrate all at once, because infants need to be obese. Infants need that energy. Think about humans. Humans are the only animals that are born obese. We're born obese and we take mom's milk in for a couple of years in order to have access to those energy sources. But once we're done with that, then all of the food available to us is either protein and fat or carbohydrate and fiber. If you pick one, you're going to do great. If you mix the two, you're going to have the problems that we have. Now, I choose for myself to go more in the carnivore route because I'm easily satiated by protein and fat. I tend to not overeat when it comes to protein and fat. I do tend to overeat when it comes to fruits and vegetables. So therefore, I find I become energy toxic when I try to incorporate a lot more carbohydrate into my diet, and I'm never really wanting to give up my fat and protein either. So if I had to pick one route, I'm going to go carnivore. If you choose to go vegan, that's fine. You're going to reduce your carbohydrate load by increasing your fiber and basically time releasing that sugar into your bloodstream with the fiber. In your colon, the healthy bacteria there are going to take that fiber and metabolize it. And what it's going to do is exchange the fiber for short chain fatty acids, which are super helpful to us. And we can become healthy. The problem becomes, because we're discussing this in the context of a healthy person. If somebody is already challenged, I think it's a little bit more difficult to go vegan and reduce type 2 diabetes, reduce insulin resistance, reduce obesity. I think it's a hell of a lot easier to do it if you're going carnivore. There is some controversy as to whether or not we become more insulin resistant when we go low carb. Some people believe that we can actually increase our insulin resistance. That's technically might not be true. What we do is when we look at muscle tissue and liver tissue, we see that on the standard American diet, when people are unhealthy, or even if they go low carb, ketogenic diet, carnivore type diet, they'll have more fat in their liver cells and in their muscle cells. But that fat got there, not because you're eating fat, but usually that fat is there because when competing, we take the extra energy that we have We have to turn it into something. We can't circulate sugar throughout the body. We have to turn it into fat. So those fat droplets that we see, that's kind of, think about marbleizing, right? So when you buy a marbleized steak, that marbleized steak is what defines a marbleized steak is the amount of fat that's in the muscle tissue because it came from an obese cow. So that cow was fed a whole bunch of grain, carbohydrates, and it deposited all of that extra, again, the fat cells can only get so fat. It needs to find new places to go. So the fat goes inside the muscle and becomes marbleized. And that's what we typically see with the standard American diet. We see these fat droplets that we believe prevents the sugar from coming into the system and being used. So we assume, oh, maybe the fat is causing the insulin resistance because the sugar can't get into the cell. But that fat that's there doesn't necessarily only come from the fat we eat. It comes from the fat we manufacture when we send sugar to our liver and we take that sugar and turn it into triglycerides for it to be stored. If we go low carb, we find that all of that goes away. All of that completely reduces. So if we go carnivore and we start losing that marbleization, we start losing that extra fat storage, our livers, clinically, I'm a clinician, I'm not a research scientist. I see what I see in practice. And when we see fatty livers disappear on a carnivore diet, that's the mechanism. When people lose fat on a carnivore diet, that's the mechanism. So then the question becomes, okay, well, if I go carnivore and I don't eat carbohydrates for a year, and then you send me for an oral glucose tolerance test, you're going to see a sugar spike that looks a whole lot like insulin resistance. And that's true, but that's because I haven't been making insulin to accommodate for a year or 6 months or 3 months or even a month. I haven't been making insulin to accommodate a sugar load like that. I haven't needed to. So if I all of a sudden take in 100 grams of carbohydrates all at once and then I do an oral glucose tolerance test, my ability to produce insulin in as rapid a state is going to be compromised, and you'll see a bigger spike. It'll look like I have insulin resistance. But if I, instead of doing the oral glucose tolerance test, if I spent a week eating some fruits and vegetables and adapted my pancreas to make insulin as needed, and then I go in for that oral glucose tolerance test, I'm not going to see that spike. So there's some controversy here on this topic, but both situations, if you want to go from standard American diet to vegan, you're going to get healthier. If you want to go from standard American diet to carnivore, you're going to get healthier. Long term, because we can't just talk about blood sugar, there's nutrients that are in meats that you're not getting when you're a vegan, and vice versa. There's nutrients in fruits and vegetables that are not present when you go carnivore, but the balance of what we need, of what is essential, is much more abundant in the carnivore lifestyle. If you go vegan, there's a lot more nutrients you're going to have to be aware that need to be supplemented. Again, that's been my experience with my patients and seeing what I see when I do lab work. So hopefully I've answered some questions. Hopefully I've created some questions for you. And, if I had to say which is the way that I would go if I had challenges of being overweight, heart disease, excessive inflammation, I would go the carnivore route for me. However, there are people who choose to go vegan, and that's fine, but limit it to, be a vegetable-tarian. Don't be a grainitarian. Don't consume those foods that are just so highly processed that the fiber has been removed. You're experiencing energy toxicity because you're taking in more energy than you can possibly store or use. And we also want to avoid having foods that are combined refined carbohydrates, again, no fiber, with fats. And that combination together is a recipe for disaster. So till next time, please put your questions in the comments. Again, it's your place for answers, but in the comments, it should be your place for questions. And I'll be happy to get back to you.